this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
June 1944 saw the largest seaborne assault in human history, D-Day. While much has been written about the operation as a whole, little detailed attention has been paid to the battle for Sword Beach itself, the easternmost of the amphibious attack areas. For this episode, I'm joined by Stephen Fisher. Stephen is a historian and archaeologist who specialises in military history. He is also the author of Sword Beach, the untold story of D-Day's forgotten victory. Thanks for joining me. We're going to be looking at the landings on Sword Beach on 6th of June. So let's start with the beach itself. I know the Atlantic Wall is inconsistent. How formidable was the Atlantic Wall in Normandy? Was it any more dense at Sword Beach than, say, Omaha?
Well, yeah, like you say, the Atlantic Wall's this sort of propaganda term. Hitler wanted to create this image of this continuous wall of concrete, for thousands of miles along the Atlantic coast, which wasn't really the case. But what you had at Sword wasn't dissimilar to what you had at Omaha, which is various defence positions that all interconnect and can cover each other. So you have several strong points along the landing area at Sword. And at Sword, the landing area that the Allies chose, Queen, White and Red Beaches, is only 1 mile wide. But within that area, you have two and a half strong points. You have Wiedelstrandel Nest 18 at the eastern end, which was codenamed Skate by the British. Pretty much near the middle, you have Wiedelstrandel Nest 20, which is codenamed Cod. And then over to the west side, you have a small intermediary strong point, Wiedelstrandel Nest 20A, which is a very small little sort of grouping of defences, shall we say, which then bridges the gap to Trout, Wiedelstrandel Nest 21, which is about it's just under a mile away to the west of the landing area. But these defences in themselves are very strong. And Cod, in fact, in the middle, was one of the strongest single defences along the entire Normandy landing area out of all 5 beaches. And it was a large company-sized fortification. It had 3 concrete bunkers with anti-tank guns connected to various personnel shelters, machine gun nests, Tobruk's, mortar positions, and, of course, all connected by trench networks and surrounded by barbed wire. And it's about just a couple of 100 metres long. It's the size of a football pitch, if you like, and one huge reinforced area. And then in between those various strong points, on the little lanes that exit the beach and go inland to the main inland road, they're all blocked with barbed wire. You have a little sort of duney-like cliff, shall we say. They're more like sand dunes, but there's this small rise as you come off the beach to get up to land level. That was covered in barbed wire, so there was no easy way to make that little ascent off of the beach and onto the roads inland. So there is a wall, if you like, but it's a barbed wire wall along most of its length, but with various strong points that cover the entire beach area, reinforced houses. Many of the houses have been taken over by the military and turned into defensive positions. And, of course, on the beach itself, numerous obstacles, tetrahedron, Czech hedgehogs, Belgian gates, to impede the progress of landing craft up onto the beach. So it was a very well-defended position. It wasn't just an open beach that the Allies could come and land on. Relative to Omaha, this is one of the very interesting things about Sword that people don't realise. Omaha was just as well defended. The big difference at Omaha, of course, is the bluffs, the sandy cliffs immediately behind the beach, which give extra elevation to the defenders. But an army intelligence unit that landed a while after D-Day and examined the defences of the Atlantic Wall worked out that mile by mile, the defences on Omaha and Sword were roughly the same. So Omaha is much bigger than Sword. It's 3.5 miles long, whereas Sword's landing area is just 1 mile long. But if you take the average number of defences per mile on both beaches, it's roughly the same numbers of anti-tank guns and machine guns.
I mean, it's all right having defensive positions. Do they have plenty of troops to put in those defensive positions?
No, so that's the big difference. So Sword area was defended by 716 Infantry Division, who were a non-combat division. They'd been raised purely for defensive roles on the Atlantic coast. But their defence area was stretched all the way up to Gold Beach and across the other side of the Caen Canal to the east as well. So they are covering a huge area, which of course is being assaulted across that area by four divisions. You have the 6th Airborne Division landing east of the Caen Canal. You have 3rd Infantry Division landing at Sword, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landing at Juno, and 50th Division landing at Gold Beach. So, yeah, the 716 Infantry Division is massively spread out. And they're a much smaller division than the British ones as well. They only have 2 infantry brigades, whereas British have 3 infantry brigades. So even though COD, Venal Strand S-20 in the middle of Sword Beach is a company-sized position, effectively, it only had a single platoon that was actually deployed within it. And many of those men as well are spread out along some of the buildings on either side. So it was a very small defensive force. Now, you do have attached infantry. There were several East European units that were attached as well. And so you have small parties of men, engineers, artillery units that are attached to these defensive positions. But yeah, it wasn't held very strongly in terms of the number of men that were present.
So I'm presuming when they chose the beaches, they don't necessarily know how many defenders are there, but it's quite a small beach compared to the rest of them. Why is Sword chosen? What are they looking for? It's the end beach as well, isn't it? It's the most eastern beach. Yeah, I was trying to work through, just get a geography right on a map.
Well, it was chosen because it was really the only sort of landing area that's suitable that far east. So back in 1942 and even 1941, when the Allies are looking at the potential return to Europe, there's already a lot of intelligence work that's going into assessing the coast of France and Belgium and the Netherlands to see where it's plausible to land people. Obviously, cliff sites are largely out because they're just very difficult to assault. Areas like Calais, they're suitable, but they're also very well defended. And they were very well defended almost immediately after Germany took hold of them. But they start looking at suitable beaches that have a suitable sort of landing area, shallow beaches, and access inland. And places like the beach at La Brèche, just outside Ouistreham, which became Sword Beach, were assessed to be suitable because they're a shallow beach, there's flat terrain inland, there's easy access inland. But even so, when Cossack and Major General Morgan started looking at where to make the invasion, and when they made their proposals in 1943, they didn't really include Sword in any great amount. They considered having a commando force land there to strike at Ouistreham and capture the battery there. But the main landing areas were going to be in what became Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, and Juno Beach, because they were basing all of this on a 3-division landing. It's when Montgomery and Eisenhower become involved at the start of 1944, and they say, no, this has to be a 5-division landing, and they have to extend the landing area. That's when Utah gets added as well. And then over to the east, they say, right, well, we'll have to make a landing here at Sword. And with the plans that Montgomery comes up with, the benefit of a landing at Sword is this ability to drive onto Caen and then reinforce as well the landings that are going to be made by airborne forces east of the Caen Canal.
Yeah, I was going to say that are those objectives, because that is really the objective for those on Sword Beach, isn't it, to get inland to Caen on the first day?
That was the hoped for objective, yes. And there's a lot of discussion about...
Is it hoped for, or does it become subsequently hoped for by Montgomery changing his mind of what his objectives were?
I don't think this debate will ever be settled. I'm not sure I'm the person to try and settle it. But it is true that in the infantry orders for 185th Infantry Brigade, the intermediate brigade, their instructions were to capture Caen. But the scale of the task that is laid out in the orders, anyone who reads those will look at that and think, well, that is an ideal objective. It is not their command. It's not their instruction. You will achieve this, but it is clearly, the plan that they would like them to fulfill. But I think anyone who reads those orders and looks at the size of Caen, the distance that 185 Infantry Brigade would have to cover, and the size of their force would realise that that's not something that can be assured. Whereas there's quite clear objectives for capturing the beach and securing that beachhead and capturing Weestrum and reinforcing the 6th Airborne Brigade. Those were very, very vital tasks, and they can clearly be achieved. But capturing Caen, I think some people have described it using modern parlance as a stretch goal, which I think is a pretty good analogy, to be honest.
So when they're looking at the planners at who needs to get on the beach and what their goals are, can you see their objectives in the planning of the waves and who's meant to land to go where? Is that all there right from the start? And I was going to say, just the logistical nightmare. Someone must have thought that through, because there must be a logistical nightmare of getting the people on the right boats in the right order to get to the right place. And we're talking, I mean, how many did we get ashore across all beaches? It's close to 100,000 men or something ridiculous across the whole lot. It's a lot of paper shuffling someone's done to figure it all out, presumably.
The logistics behind D-Day are absolutely fascinating, and that's actually another sort of area that I work on, which is the logistics of getting everyone onto the correct landing craft, and how they achieved that on this side of the channel. Because just the act of manoeuvring your troops from their marshalling camps to the correct embarkation area to meet the correct landing craft at the correct time, make sure that the correct landing craft is taking them to the correct bit of beach to the correct schedule, is a masterpiece of planning. And what's amazing is, they pulled it off. They managed to load the entire D-Day force in the space of about 5 days and get everyone onto the right vessels without a huge traffic jam developing on the south coast of England, which would have ruined everything. The delays that could have been had by traffic jams would have prevented most troops getting onto their vessels, but it worked. And that's a testament to some absolutely brilliant planning. And because of that success, everyone is in the right place, or rather on the right vessel, to then be landed in the correct order on the beaches. And as you say, that's another logistical nightmare, essentially, working out the best order in which to get troops onto the beach. And largely, the order in which it's done on Sword, and Sword is an easy beach to look at this on, because it was a small beach. So it was a 1 brigade front. If you go to Juno or Gold or Omaha, they're landing on a 2 brigade front. So they have essentially 2 landing areas with 2 assault battalions on each bit. So on Gold and Juno, there's 4 assault battalions going in at the first wave, because there's 2 brigades going in at the same time. On Sword, it's just 1 brigade front. So it's quite easy to break down the order in which stuff happens. So the very first waves to land are the assault waves with the mission to capture the beach. And that's your swimming DD tanks, your Hobarts, Funnies, AVR, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, who are there to penetrate the beach defences, blow through the beach obstacles, blow through the barbed wire, clear the strong points that are going to hold up the infantry. And the 2 assault battalions will help with that as well. Then you have your reserve battalion of the 1st Assault Brigade, who are there to then push through behind the beach and capture the immediate ground inland to give you a sort of staging post, if you like, for your 2nd intermediate wave. And this is 185 Brigade on Sword Beach, and their role then is to get their 3 battalions on land and drive inshore. And their mission is to head straight for Caen. And then your 3rd Brigade, your reserve brigade, comes ashore. They had a mission to sort of make a right hook round to the west to support the drive on Caen and capture the land between Sword Beach and Juno Beach and meet up with the advancing Canadians over on their western side. The process of landing everyone on the beach was very carefully constructed and drawn up in what are called landing tables, which basically list all of the units on each vessel and the order in which they are intended to go ashore. So each vessel load, if you like, is given a number, and they will land chronologically in that order, if you like.
There must be volumes and volumes of these things that must have been mass-produced so everyone could work out. Everyone must have needed a copy.
Well, to a certain extent, yes and no. It blows my mind to think about how they actually drew this up in the days before computers. Because, it would be a horrific Excel spreadsheet. And I know, because I've tried drawing one up, it's not easy. But to have done it essentially by hand or with typewriters, and to make all the amendments that would have been necessary is mind-blowing. once you've done that, it's really only the senior commanders that need all of it. And what you can then do is just pass down the relevant bits to the individual forces, brigade level, battalion level, unit level, and just tell everyone which vessel they need to be on. And you just give them that number that has been assigned to that vessel load. So each landing craft, of course, has a mix of units on it. You don't have an entire regiment landing from one landing craft. You have several platoons from that regiment, along with engineers, artillery spotters, medics. Various units from different regiments and different units are all put together on one landing craft. So they all have to be split up back in the UK and told which number they are. As long as they get on the vessel that has their number on it, then they're on the right vessel and they will be landed in the right place at the right time according to the plan that they've been given.
Presumably you're mixing them up because it's robust. If they lose one vessel, you haven't really scuppered the whole plan. There's still somebody else there to pick up that part of their mission.
Yeah, exactly that. So you spread your units across a wide number of vessels, and then you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. And also you need that mix of people. You need engineers to accompany the infantry. They need that support that normally, of course, would just be, they would walk over to the necessary unit and carry out the assault. But because this is amphibious, they have to be on the landing craft in advance.
I have visions of sort of offices of people who just sat staring at tables, double checking, almost like bingo, that they haven't got two units on on the same boat by accident, or the boat's been double booked. Or
yeah, there is that, and then suddenly a senior commander says, "Actually, I need this unit to be here," or something like that, and
then the whole tables are all thrown out, and everyone has to do a bit of a reshuffle.
And each landing craft, you have to think about things like weight and space, and how you're going to fit 9 Shermans onto the deck of a single landing craft tank, along with 2 Bren gun carriers or something like that. It's the logistics of fitting the troops and the vehicles onto the landing craft itself is a minefield.
I guess the D-Day, from the D-Day point of view, it sort of starts with the airborne going in. Does that tip off the Germans around Sword that something's happening? Are they thinking, those officers on the field, on the spot, I should say, in and around the beach, that this could be D-Day, could be the invasion day?
It seems to have not been quite as clear-cut as that. So very early on, when the landings, the airborne landings are taking place, you have the commander of 736 Regiment at his strong point at Hillman sees some of these landings taking place, and he thinks it's the invasion, and he tells his commanding officer, General Richter, down in Caen, this is the invasion, but Richter's not so sure. And even when Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, telephones Rommel at 6 o'clock in the morning, they're not convinced it's the invasion. They think it might be a raid. And there's still no certainty that this is actually going to be D-Day. When General Marx of the 8th Army finally decides to unleash 21st Panzer Division, who are all based south of Caen, and allow them to move up to the landing areas, he actually sends them all into the airborne sector. Because this is 6 o'clock in the morning, so the landings on Sword Beach haven't happened yet. And the first unit he wants to counter is all of these airborne forces that have landed east of the Caen Canal. So he sends them up there, east of Caen, east of the canal, which of course moves them entirely away from the Sword landing area because they can't easily cross that canal. It's not until midday that they're ordered over to Sword Beach, by which time, of course, the landings have been in progress for 4.5 hours. So even early in the morning on 6th of June at 6 a.m., the landings haven't happened yet and nobody's willing to sort of guess where they might be. So I don't really think any of the German forces were really tipped off as to where the landings at Sword would be by the airborne landings.
There is a big air raid as well, isn't there? Does that not tip them off a bit more? Are they bombing the beaches? Are they bombing, interdicting further in railheads and things to stop movements, that big air raid that happens just before?
There's an air raid overnight, and there's bombing all inland in France, and so there's a constant stream of aircraft passing over. The first proper raid on Sword area is at 5 in the morning, and that's carried out by Free Bomber Group of the RAF. And several squadrons pass over Ouistreham to bomb the coastal battery there. And they inflict a lot of damage on the town, and the town is left pretty much ablaze. But even that doesn't seem to have tipped the Germans off entirely. It's kind of a giveaway with hindsight, but with so many confused reports coming in at the time. And in fact, even at sea, Flotilla Commander Heinrich Hoffmann, is sent out from Le Havre with his group of destroyers to try and intercept these fragmentary reports that they have of vessels off Arromanches, I think is where he's first directed to go to. So there's a lot of very confused reports coming in, German high command and HQs. I think it's very difficult for them to make sense of exactly what's happening and whether or not this is just a very big raid or if it is actually the invasion. Because nobody was expecting the invasion on this day.
Does the penny finally start to drop when they can see the fleet and the fleet? Because the fleet sort of wheels into view and then just opens fire, doesn't it? Is that to start covering fire? Ship-to-shore bombardment?
Nearly. I think the penny drops when Hoffmann leads his destroyers out from Le Havre, and he emerges from this smoke screen that is being laid by British aircraft to shield the invasion fleet from Le Havre. And he drives through this smoke cloud and then comes out the other side, and suddenly his three little destroyers are faced with this huge fleet. They can see battleships, cruisers, and then hundreds of smaller craft all jostling around a couple of miles away in the distance. And they quickly realise that this is far bigger than they can cope with. They get close enough to launch a pattern of torpedoes and then turn around and head back into the smoke. At that point, the penny's dropping, especially as at the same time as he's doing that, the big warships of Bombardment Force D, which are supporting Force S, the amphibious force landing on Sword Beach, they open fire on the gun batteries east of the Caen Canal and start bombarding them. And suddenly, yes, you have a very large naval task force off the beach. And of course, not just there as well. You have them off all of the beaches at this stage, and reports are going to be flooding back into the HQs where they can of a massive invasion fleet. And I think that's when the penny probably drops, but they're not certain exactly where everyone's going to be landing. And at Sword, yeah, they seem to have not really clicked that there was going to be a landing immediately north of Caen.
So when those first landing craft are going in, are they accompanied all the way in by an offshore battery covering their assault? Yes,
so the big warships, the battleships and the cruisers of Bombardment Force D, their mission is to suppress these coastal batteries, the really big guns that can fire out to sea. But when the landing craft go in, they're supported at Sword by a dozen destroyers who go into within 2.5 miles of the beach, and they basically form a line parallel to the beach. And about 45 minutes before the invasion, before the landings are due to commence, they open fire. Some of them opened fire earlier than that. There's very clear evidence in the reports that some of them opened fire a full 15 minutes early. But their task is to suppress all of the beach defences. So rather than the coastal batteries that the bigger warships are dealing with, they're just there to fire on the strong points, the bunkers, the machine gun posts, the anti-tank guns, all of those things. And for 45 minutes, they systematically pound at Sword about 5 miles of beach, anywhere that there's an enemy position.
Did the intelligence fairly accurately pinpoint what was there for them to hit?
Yes. So I've looked at the fleet orders for Force S, and they identify with 6-figure grid references, 8-figure grid references, detailed descriptions of various strong points. And they are accurate. They are so accurate, because you can then, of course, look at photographs that were taken after the landings and, the physical evidence that remains today. And they got it so right. They picked up most of the strong points. There are a couple of bunkers that they missed, but in the main, they've nailed everything. So yeah, they're able to pound these pretty much at leisure because they're out of range of most of the guns that are positioned on the beach. And as the landing craft go in on their flanks, they're then supported by smaller support vessels. So landing craft that have been converted to carry guns. So the landing craft tank was converted into numerous different roles. Landing craft gun with 2 4.7-inch guns. Landing craft flak with an array of 20 and 40 millimeter guns, and the landing craft rocket, of course, which fires more than 1,000 of these 2-pound rockets at the beach in great waves. And as the landing craft approach the beach, basically, systematically, these weapons all open fire on the beach to further support the landings. And then at the same time, from above, you have the aerial bombardment. So the 8th Air Force, the US 8th Air Force, then pass over Gold, Omaha, Juno and Sword beaches and drop bombs on the beach defences. They largely miss, unfortunately, because they're flying above the cloud and they were hampered by very last-minute instructions that told them to delay the dropping of the bombs if there was cloud cover for fear of hitting their own troops. But then at the very last, at the sort of crescendo of this bombardment, you have fighter bombers, Typhoons, go in with 500-pound bombs and drop them on the strong points as well. And then the bombardment lifts just a couple of minutes before touchdown. So basically, you've had 45 minutes of sustained fire on all of these defences along the beach, which is very, very good at suppressing the enemy gunners.
Those beaches, you mentioned before, there is actually defences as the hedgehogs dig into the sea. How do the landing craft deal with them before they can even get the men to the beach?
Well, the whole idea of the landing was to land at low tide, so all of those obstacles would be on the sand rather than in the water. Now, this isn't what the Germans were expecting, because all of their guns are sighted to fire along the beach, assuming a landing at high tide. But the Allies decide to land at low tide so that they don't run the risk of hitting those obstacles. And then they have engineer parties and Royal Navy parties whose task is to clear those obstacles and clear lanes through them for the vessels that are landing later and for the tanks that are going to drive up the beach. So the plan is land at low tide. As the tide comes in, you have engineers working above the high tide mark, Royal Engineers, as it comes up. And then you have Royal Navy teams, landing craft obstacle clearance units that will work behind the tide, if you like, and they're going to try and blow up some of the obstacles as well. They're all going to land in the first couple of waves in the first 20 minutes and carry out these tasks. Unfortunately, at Sword Beach and at all of the other beaches, you have strong weather. So the hangover, if you like, of this storm that had caused the delay of D-Day by 24 hours. And that's a quite strong northwesterly wind that's pushing the tide as it comes in faster and higher and pushing everything slightly to the east as well. And that drives the tide in very fast with quite high waves. And so it makes it very difficult for the Royal Navy landing craft obstacle clearance units to do their job. And in fact, they didn't. They couldn't. It was just too dangerous. And the engineers very quickly come under very heavy fire from the beach defences, and it makes it very difficult for them to do their work above the waterline. So the net result is most of the clearance of obstacles on Sword Beach was carried out by the landing craft themselves by ramming the obstacles.
So that first wave that comes in, and what's it like for them? By some miracle, I don't know if it's miracle of planning, let's put it that way, the tanks arrive at the same time as the infantry at Sword, don't they? Which is exactly what's meant to happen.
Almost precisely what was meant to happen. So Sword Beach is the only place where the swimming DD tanks are deployed as intended successfully. So they deployed them as intended at Omaha Beach, half of them, and they all sank, unfortunately. The other half were taken directly into the beach by the landing craft, and they landed as regular tanks would. Same thing happens at Gold and Juno Beach. The captains of the landing craft decide it's too dangerous to launch at sea, so they take them very close to the beach. Most of them almost onto the beach itself. Some of them launch about 1,000 yards off. But at Sword, the commanders decided it was safe enough to launch the DD tanks at 5,000 yards out. So the swimming tanks swim in as they were meant to. They are a little bit slower because of this strong current. They can only make 3 knots rather than 4 knots. So the landing craft carrying Hobart's funnies, the armored vehicle Royal Engineers, they catch up with them. And they all land together at roughly the same time, with the infantry and their much smaller landing craft assault sort of coming in and filling the gaps. So they all come ashore starting at 7:26, 1 minute behind schedule. And over the next 10 minutes, pretty much all of the Hobart's funnies are ashore on their landing craft, and the infantry are piling out of their landing craft assault as well. So yes, they all sort of hit the beach at the same time. But they immediately sort of land into a wall of enemy fire, because the bombardment, which looked very impressive and was very successful at suppressing the gunners, hasn't killed and destroyed everything. And that was never really its intention. It was meant to suppress the defences, but these are thick concrete bunkers. They're not going to be easy to destroy. And as soon as the bombardment lifts, the Germans are able to come out of their shelters and get to their guns, and they very quickly start firing on the invading force. And the very first vessel ashore, landing craft tank 947, is hit very quickly by either anti-tank shells or maybe mortars. Nobody's quite sure which. And they disable the second tank to be leaving the landing craft in the ramp, and nothing else is able to get off behind it. And that landing craft comes in for some very serious attention from the Germans. They fire on it very heavily, and there's a lot of destruction on board. Fortunately, the other landing craft are able to disembark most of their units, and the infantry are able to get ashore. But in front of Strongpoint Cod, this very well-defended piece of land in the middle of the beach, for instance, I think it's, I want to say 8th Platoon of B Company of the 2nd East Yorkshire Regiment. Yeah, Lieutenant Rutherford's platoon, he loses half of his men on the beach. Only half of them are able to get across that sand dune and up onto the road behind the barbed wire. Such is the strength of the positions that they're trying to overcome.
What's the distance if the tide's out? What's the distance of the beach they have to cover?
But it happens all very quickly. It's a couple of 100 metres at low tide, but then that shrinks very, very quickly.
Was the tide on the literally on the turn as they came in then?
It had turned not long before. So as they landed, it was on a slowly incoming tide. Low water was, I think, about 30 minutes earlier. But the weather played hell with all of those, predictions. And so nothing was quite as expected. By the time the first units come ashore, the water is already lapping around the base of the first line of beach obstacles, which it wasn't supposed to have been doing. The hope was it would be lower than that, but it's already racing up the beach. And within 2 hours, the beach is very, very narrow as a result because the tide has driven up so fast.
In the first wave, you've got one landing craft tank knocked out, moving around. As the obstacles get covered up, you'll have people trying to negotiate their way through them, ram them, more detritus on the beach. It gets described as waves. Oh, the next wave came in. Is it more, do these waves increasingly be just sort of chaotic, kind of just get people onto the beach? Or do they manage to keep some sort of coherence to them as they're trying to negotiate? As you say, it's a mile long. It's not very big.
They do manage to keep some coherence, which is to the credit of the landing craft commanders. They do have to adjust a little bit as necessary, and there's plenty of reports of the landing craft commanders deciding rather than beach where they intended to, they move east or west a little bit where there's more space.
Do they do that in their is a group of
their flotillas?
I was going to say, is it a group of landing craft, the flotilla?
Yeah, in the main, the flotilla commander would usually say, right, we're going to go a little bit further east or a little bit further west, or the commanders in the landing craft headquarters, which is about half a mile off the shore, was signalling them and saying, head further east, there's more space that way. And yeah, they do have to avoid the preceding wave of vessels because many of them are hung up on the obstacles. They're taking longer to disembark their troops, and so the beach is more blocked. There's several wrecks floating around between the obstacles as well by this point, because some of the vessels, after they landed, they then try and back off the beach and they discover that they've got a big hole in the hull, and they have to abandon their vessels. So there's a lot of detritus, like you say, floating around. And with the tide racing in quicker, you have a lot of tanks on the beach that are very quickly being immobilized either by enemy fire or by the tide. And then they're blocking the sand as well because they're right on the waterline. And as the landing craft commanders are coming in, they just have this collection of vehicles that aren't moving right in front of them, and that's not a good place to try and disembark other vehicles.
Yes, you've got allied obstacles rather than the enemy obstacles to negotiate. And presumably a landing craft hits the beach going forwards, but that's not to say it's going forwards when the tide pushes it to the side, so it becomes quite a wide obstacle.
Yes, and quite often many of them were broaching too, so they're swinging round and being pushed almost sideways up against the beach, which is very, very bad from a maritime point of view. It makes it much harder to get your vessel off the beach, and it makes it very hard to get the vehicles and the troops off as well. From
a command and control perspective, in those early waves, how did they select the troops to do them? Were those troops specifically briefed on what's anticipated of them? Because I assume they expected a high casualty rate, at which point you have to allow for your officers being taken out of action, and that you need to keep the momentum up. So they specifically trained troops that go in those first few waves?
Yes, so they knew that there would be the assault waves, and these are infantry battalions from the 8th Infantry Brigade, 2nd East Yorks on the left flank, so on Queen Red Beach, the 1st South Lancashire Regiment on Queen White Beach on the right flank. They had very specific objectives, which was to overcome these strong points and clear lanes, if you like, off the beach, and get inland and make safe those exits so that the reserve companies of the same battalions could then exploit those and help with suppressing the strong points. So they knew what was expected of them, and it was quite a daunting task. I would have to do it, and especially knowing what the defences were like, and they had very good intelligence on what the defences would be like, boggles the mind to think what must have been going through their minds when they make their landing. And of course, they'd been fed lots of information. The bombardment will pulverise everyone. Some of them might have believed that, others might not have. Certainly the Royal Navy probably didn't believe it. They knew that they would be able to suppress positions, but not necessarily destroy them. Their tasks were very specific in clearing the beach area. And how they went about that was, of course, left at a lower level than division. That was left at brigade level. And so the brigade commander, Copper Cass, was able to instruct his battalion commanders on what he wanted them to achieve. And the battalion commanders decide the best way they're going to do that and assign the platoons based on the skills of the officers and that sort of thing. But many of the officers became casualties quite quickly. The 1st South Lancashires, A Company was one of the assault companies, and Major Harwood, I believe it was killed very early on. So you lose company commanders very quickly. He could see one of his platoons trying to breach the wire with a Bangalore torpedo, which is one of these explosive charges, a long cylindrical tube that you slide under barbed wire, detonates and blows all the barbed wire out of the way. And he watched from behind an obstacle as the men slid it under, ignited the fuse, retreated to a safe distance, but it didn't go off. So he actually ran forward to try and fix it. And he was shocked as he was doing that. He managed to crawl forward, fix the fuse and ignite it again, but he died of his wounds quite soon after. And those sorts of stories are the same all along the beach. The platoon commander of that platoon who was assisting was also killed as well. So very quickly, these units start losing their officers, who are, few and far between, relatively speaking. But, of course, the platoon itself is well briefed on what they need to do, so the NCOs can take over. And then once the reserve companies come up behind them, they can incorporate them into their unit as well.
You think of the popular fiction of D-Day, it's all about those assault landing craft, the Higgins boats, the LCAs coming in. But there are some much bigger landing craft. The landing craft infantry are large, dropping hundreds of troops at a time. There's the landing craft tanks, dropping multiple tanks and vehicles. How quickly can those start coming in? Because presumably once it's safe enough for those to come in, you can really start putting a lot of men across the beach.
Yeah, so the landing craft infantry, and I know you did a podcast on this recently as well, which is very enjoyable. The expected disembarkation time for the landing craft infantry was, I think off the top of my head, something like 4 minutes, which is, if you're in a nice peaceful dock on a sunny day, this was probably achievable. But when you're under fire and the tide or enemy mortars are destroying the ramps that you push off the bow, it's not going to be anything like that. And some landing craft infantry were on the beach for an hour and still unable to disembark their men. Now, at Omaha, they took a big gamble which didn't pay off, and they put several landing craft infantry ashore. I think it was something like 45 minutes after the initial landing, and both of those were destroyed. Then at Sword, they weren't going to use any of the landing craft infantry large until the very end of the assault wave. So we're talking more than 90 minutes after the initial landings, much, much later. The idea being that by then, the beach will be largely secure, and then you can bring your bigger troop transports in and disembark the men in relatively good order in what is hopefully a safe situation. It didn't work at Omaha, and it didn't really work at Sword either. Such was the nature of the defences on the beach. They hadn't been fully suppressed, and there was still a lot of artillery fire and mortar fire being dropped on the beach, which is fairly accurate as spotters who are able to observe the form of shot and target these landing craft infantry. So, there's nothing like the 4 minute disembarkation time. there was a much smaller type of landing craft infantry. So the landing craft infantry large could carry 200 men. You also had the landing craft infantry small, which was a wooden boat built by motor torpedo boat manufacturers. It was a Fairmile design, which could carry 100 men, and they were used to land the commandos. So 1st Special Service Brigade, Lord Lovett, 4 Commando, 3 Commando, 6 Commando, and 41 Royal Marine Commando. They land much earlier. So the first 2 of those land 30 minutes into the landings. And then Lord Lovett and the 1st Special Service Brigade come ashore after about 90 minutes as well. They face the same difficulties. They have ramps to push off the bow rather than just a big vehicular ramp at the front. And they have similar problems of the ramps becoming tangled up because of the tide or being shot away. But because they're smaller and lighter, they're able to get their men off much quicker and face less consequences, shall we say, from enemy action because they're a slightly smaller target. So they were a bit more successful in putting troops onto the shore. There were several meetings after D-Day about whether or not this was actually a good type of vessel. The commandos didn't think so. They thought they were bullet magnets and ludicrous. But they at least meant that it was able to put more troops ashore in a shorter time than the landing craft assault could manage, because the landing craft assault was the British version of the Higgins boat. That can only carry 30 men, 35 men.
Presumably you only had so many of them, and once those waves had gone, they have to go back to be refilled?
They would go back to the lowering position, the fleet anchorage, which is about 9 miles offshore, to refill from troop transports. And yes, that's a couple of hours that they'll be away doing that. So yes, there were only so many landing craft that could fulfill this task. And yeah, that meant that the order of landing and the means by landing had to be carefully considered. And pretty much the Allies are deploying almost any landing craft they have. Now, we did have plenty more landing craft tank of earlier types, Mark 1s, Mark 2s, and Mark 3s, which weren't used because we didn't need any more of them. But for getting the infantry ashore, we needed pretty much every vessel that was available to us, hence the use of the landing craft infantry small. And in fact, there were more landing craft assault deployed at Sword than there were at Juno or Gold, because of this the different nature of the landings, the fact this was a 1 brigade front rather than a 2 brigade front at those 2 beaches.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm discussing the D-Day landings on Sword Beach with Stephen Fisher. So at what point are the strong points, I was deemed to be neutralised? My assume is the assumption is that the beach is under occasional fire, probably for the next day or 2. But at what point is the immediate beach secured?
So it's not easy to tell with all of the strong points. Cod is basically so big that it's neutralised by a combination of men from various different units, come in various different waves. And so they all give their own little reports on the little bit of action they fought, but there's no unified picture of the fall of Cod. You just get little bits of detail in various different war diaries or memoirs. Cod seems to have been active for at least 2 hours before it is fully neutralised. And even then, there are some bunkers that the British don't go into until they're sure that the Germans have surrendered. And some of the bunkers, they lock themselves in and wait for several hours before they come out with a white flag. So Cod is a very difficult one to tell, but very early on, Major Banger King from the A Company of the East Yorkshire Battalion, he's charging through the barbed wire and leading his company to try and neutralise some of the outer gun positions, but they can't get into the middle, and it's not until the South Lancashire's attack from the western side, and then the reserve companies come ashore, plus other troops from the 2nd Middlesex Regiment, the machine gun battalion attached to the division, and engineers, that they actually managed to force their way in, reinforced, of course, by tanks that managed to flail their way with the Sherman flail tanks through the barbed wire and start blasting some of these positions point blank. So Cod is uncertain, but yeah, a good couple of hours at least. Over on the eastern flank, Skate, or Weedle Strandle Nest 18, this is a much smaller affair. There's one big anti-tank gun bunker and a 50-centimetre anti-tank gun in a hexagonal open position, and a couple of machine gun posts, barbed wire defences all around it, some trenches. That was supposed to be neutralised by the East Yorkshire Battalion. And certainly the anti-tank gun appears to have been put out of action by one of the Sherman crab flails that comes ashore in the first wave. From the descriptions, the only viable candidate I can see for knocking that gun out is one of the crab flails. And there's pictures of the gun afterwards. It's clearly been demolished. And the observers who went ashore a couple of days later looked at the bunker and said, yeah, it appears that this was hit by a shell from a tank rather than a naval shell. And certainly that gun position was firing on the beaches when the first landings were made. But even so, the East Yorks aren't able to neutralise it fully. So a number 4 commando land, 35 minutes after the first wave, they actually land right in front of Skate at the very eastern end of the landing area. And they then feel the full weight of fire from its machine gun positions, and they have to neutralise the rest of that strong point before they can advance off the beach to make their attack on Weestrom. So Skate falls at about, I'm going to say, around about 8:15, thereabouts, just before before the commandos go inshore and then make their advance on Weestrom.
So it's not as if the strong points are a roadblock, they get bypassed.
Some of them are bypassed, yeah. So already units are bypassing COD and just carrying out their other objectives, whereas others have to be neutralised because they're firing on the beach. Then, of course, you have the strong points further down the beach on either side. So about half a mile to the east, you have Weedlestrand Nest number 10. That was a target for the French commandos. So their mission was to go and neutralise that. And then on the western side, you have Trout, Weedlestrand Nest 21. That's about a mile away, and that's the target for 41 Royal Marine Commando. And they have to fight their way through Lyon-sur-Mer to get to it, which they don't achieve. Lyon-sur-Mer is very, very well defended by the Germans. Trout is a significant strong point, and they're able to hold out for a couple of days.
Presumably, the more they get on the beach, the more pressure they put on the strong points, the less the strong points fire at the beach and are forced to fire at those people who are attacking it, which allows more people to arrive on the beach.
Exactly that, yeah. So when the initial landings are taking place, COD is able to fire all along the length of the beaches. It can attack or fire on the attackers. But as you say, as more and more tanks start to gather around it, they're forced into a more self-defense mode. They're targeting the people who are attacking them rather than being able to fire down the length of the beach. So yes, as you get more and more units coming ashore, the strong points are almost being smothered, if you like, by the sheer weight of vehicles and men that are now appearing around their perimeter.
So I assume as men are bypassing, they've all got their bicycles. We've seen pictures of them running off the landing craft carrying their bicycles. They're now pedalling furiously to Cannes. What does hold them up on that inland bicycle ride? I do wonder if in France there's an enormous heap somewhere of rusty bikes where as soon as they got off the beach, they dump the blooming things.
Well, some units did. So in the initial wave, the assault wave, the only units that had bicycles were individual troops of each commando. So 6 commando had one troop had bicycles, 3 commando, 1 troop had bicycles, and 45 Royal Marine Commando, who were also going to the beaches, one of their troops had bicycles. They did use them. The bicycle troops pedalled off furiously to try and get to Pegasus Bridge ahead of the leading infantry. Whether they made it or not, the times of arrival at Pegasus Bridge are very, very difficult to ascertain accurately. I think, really, they're all arriving at Pegasus Bridge. The infantry of 6 Commando, the commandos of 6 Commando and the bicycle troops are all arriving at Pegasus Bridge sometime between 12:30 and 1 o'clock. It's the intermediate brigade, 185 Brigade, that has more units of bicycles, where entire companies were equipped with bicycles to keep up with the armour and the advanced column that was going to strike out towards Caen. So some units were going to literally sit on the tanks as they advanced so that they had vehicle power to get them, and they would be supported by a column of infantry following up behind, but also bicycle infantry that would be able to keep up with them. Now, as it happens, the plans didn't go to plan at all. The armour was late getting off the beach because one of the problems at Sword Beach is the delays in securing the exits meant that there weren't enough places for people to get off the beach. And with the tide driving up very quickly, there's not enough space to manoeuvre on the beach. And so there's a lot of delays getting off the beach in the mid-morning at Sword Beach, and the armour of the second wave, if you like, isn't able to get off the beach on schedule. And this causes a delay for this column that's supposed to advance on Caen. And that's where the problems, everything starts to unravel with that. The bicycle troops don't have a column to follow. Many of them ditch their bicycles instead of using them. And yeah, there were piles of bicycles, according to many eyewitness accounts, on the side of the road, because they very quickly just became more trouble than they were worth. And many of them, of course, sort of, immersed in salt water for a while and then covered in sand. And that's not an easy thing to pedal. And these are, they're not modern plush mountain bikes or anything like that. Right?
No, robust, heavy things. Is that push on that first day, is there real hiccup before the German defensive position with the British call it Hillman, is that the thing that stops them moving on Caen?
It is partially. So Hillman is a very large defensive position on the first ridge inland, Perrier Ridge. It's about 2 miles inland from Sword Beach. And it dominates most of the road approaches leading off the beach in the direction of Caen. So it has a very good field of fire. It has machine gun posts in steel cupolas, so very well entrenched positions. It has anti-tank guns, and it has a brilliant field of fire. The column that is meant to advance on Caen actually manages to bypass it, but this column is very fragmented and only consists of 1 battalion of infantry, rather than 3 battalions of infantry, which it's meant to have. It does have the tanks, but again, they are very spread out. And so that unit manages to bypass Hillman, but isn't as strong as it is intended to be. And that's where its advance falters. The reason they're able to bypass Hillman is almost certainly because at the moment they're passing it, Hillman is concentrating on defending itself against an attack by the Suffolk Regiment, who are one of the assault battalions, the reserve assault battalion of the first wave, and their mission was to neutralise this town of Colleville-le-Orne. It's now called Colleville-Montgomery. And their mission was to overcome this town and the 2 strong points within it. One was an artillery position and one was Hillman. But Hillman is a much stronger nut than was expected. So I talked about how accurate the Allied intelligence was on all of the beach defences. And it was fairly accurate for Hillman. They knew it was there. They just didn't realise how strong it was. They didn't know about these steel cupolas. They didn't know about the size of the defence. And they didn't realise it was actually a regimental headquarters. They thought it was a battalion headquarters rather than brigade size. So it's much more strongly defended. Also, a lot of the infantry that have abandoned their positions on the beach, with the weight of the advancing Allies, they've all withdrawn to Hillman. So there's quite a lot of men there to defend it. So really, it never had a chance of holding out more than a day, but it is able to hold out longer than the Allies expected it to. And it forms this block around which other units aren't able to progress with any great speed past it. And that slows the advance again. So you have all of these various things that start slowing everything down. There's the delays on the beach, the difficulty of combining the units for their intended advance, and then the slowdown of other units because of Hillman. And this is all pretty much to be expected, to be honest. But it does mean that the ultimate objective of Caen starts to unravel.
So at the end of that first day, how far inland had they managed to penetrate from Sword Beach?
Off the top of my head, it's about 7 miles, I think.
How far is Caen? Caen can't be that far away. It must be on the horizon.
They could see Caen. At the very high point of the Allied advance, they managed to get into the next ridge after Perrier Ridge, is a village called Lebacy. And they managed to get into the woods of Lebacy, and just briefly, they are able to see Caen down in the next valley. But that is as close as they will get. And that is the only time they will see Caen before they eventually get into Caen a month later. Forced to withdraw out of Lebacy, they attack it again the next day, but the Germans by now have entrenched themselves along that ridge. And they're not able to make any more headway. But they've still managed to capture a significant piece of land. They've made a very significant advance inland. They've linked up with the airborne forces over on the east. They haven't managed to link up with Juno yet, but they will do the next day. they've given themselves a very, very good beachhead and a place from which to invest Caen over the next month and form that perimeter around the northern side of it, which prevents the Germans from breaking back out to the north and up to the beaches. And of course, the Germans did try, because 21st Panzer Division, who had initially been sent to attack the airborne forces, at midday they receive instructions to redeploy west of the Caen Canal and attack the landing beaches. And this is chaotic for them because they now have to get across the Caen Canal. And that means going back to Caen because Pegasus Bridge is in Allied hands. They can't cross there. So they have to go back to Caen, which is an absolute hellhole of traffic jams and broken buildings. Bombing raids had brought down buildings, blocked streets, all sorts of things. So it's not until 4 o'clock that they're able to get through Caen and position themselves at Lebacy, ready to make the first armoured counterattack. And because it's so late in the day, they do counterattack, but they're quite quickly repulsed, most of their columns. There are 3 columns that try and break through to the north. 2 tank columns are both repulsed by the Staffordshire Yeomanry, the tank regiment that had advanced south. Even though they were delayed, they were in a good defensive position by then. The only column that is able to get through is a Panzer Grenadier column, so not much armour, but plenty of infantry, that managed to reach Lyon-sur-Mer, which has been holding out all morning against the Allies. But they're not able to tip the balance in the German favour. They're not strong enough, and they don't have any armour with them to support an attack then on the beach area.
So Chester Wilmot, after the war, is quite critical of the commanders at Sword for lacking drive to push further inland. Well, I was going to say, is this fair? Because in many respects, everything actually seems to have gone quite right, considering at Sword.
It wasn't fair, I would say. No, having read his account and his dialogue with Brigadier Cass, who was the brigadier of the assault brigade, and with the commander of the Suffolk Regiment, I rather think that he had an opinion before he wrote his book and wasn't going to be changed from that opinion. And his complaints were that the British weren't aggressive enough and lacked sufficient drive to, and I seem to recall his wording was something like they didn't pursue the Germans. And you can't pursue a place like Hillman. He thought that the British spent too long planning the attack on Hillman, which again I don't think is fair, because by the time the Suffolk Regiment got to Hillman, they had already attacked a town and one other strong point, and they'd come across a beach under fire. So they had a lot of work to do. And then they have a choice. They can either rush Hillman or they can carefully plan it and make sure that the attack succeeds. And they go for the latter option. Even so, they're still working as fast as they can. They're not sat on their bums waiting for armoured support to come and do the job for them. They're planning infantry assaults and trying to neutralise Hillman as quickly as they can. But it's a tough nut. And Wilmot doesn't seem to have appreciated that. And he described Cass as too slow, and he described Reddy, the divisional commander, as too slow and ponderous and not dour, I think is how he described him. And I think these are very unfair descriptions that are written with the benefit of hindsight, that if we had captured Hillman, then we could have got Caen kind of attitude, which don't really take into account the problems that were being faced at the time, which is, getting enough troops up off the beach, which is a traffic jam, and overcoming very strong points of resistance. Sword is the most heavily defended sector of the landing areas on all of the Normandy beachfronts inland of the beaches. Every other beach, once you'd cleared the beaches, there were no major strong points to overcome as you advance inland. At Sword, the Germans knew that was the gateway to Caen, and they'd reinforced it, hence the scale of Hillman, hence 2 very strong coastal batteries that are firing on the beach, numerous units, plus 21st Panzer Division coming in with a counterattack, the only armoured counterattack on D-Day. At Sword Beach, the British really did score an underappreciated victory in that they secured that very significant landing area. They secured a very important beachhead. They joined up with the 6th Airborne Division and secured positions from which to invest Caen over the next month and essentially blockade it to the north. This is constantly overlooked because Wilmot's opinion, I think, has been rather unfairly repeated over and over and over again by other people. Major General Belcham, who was Montgomery's chief of staff, repeated the same sort of accusation without really seeming to take into account the obstacles that 3rd Infantry Division faced. And I think because everyone says, oh, they didn't get Caen, it's even in Saving Private Ryan, they didn't get Caen, so people always think that the landings at Sword really didn't achieve their objectives. And I argue that they did. They did a very, very good job.
It is a fascinating thought process to go down, is why Sword overlooked. I mean, you could argue that all the British beaches are overlooked thanks to Hollywood. And certainly since Saving Private Ryan, everything is overlooked other than that opening scene on Saving Private Ryan. That's not to knock it. It's a fantastic 20 minutes opening of a film that gives you some impression what it might have been like. But
I think it goes back earlier.
You think? Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it goes back to The Longest Day and Chester Wilmot again. I mean, Chester Wilmot spends something like 10 pages talking about Omaha and bloody Omaha. He spends 4 sentences on the assault waves at Sword Beach. He basically says, oh, they landed. And when you watch The Longest Day, you get this impression that Omaha again is bloody Omaha. There's a large quantity of time is spent on the Americans being pinned down on the beach and heavy casualties and overcoming the obstacles. Whereas at Sword Beach, the only exposure you get at Sword Beach is Lord Lovett, played by Peter Lawford, and his piper Bill Millin, and the commandos coming ashore. There's some fire, there's sporadic machine gun fire, and the artillery shells come down. A couple of men are shot, but in the main they wade ashore, and then they're greeted by a Frenchman with a bottle of champagne, and it's all very jolly. And then you get the impression that they just advance and land to Pegasus Bridge, and that's it. You also see Kenneth Moore playing Maud, who is on the wrong beach. They place him on Sword, but really he was on Juno in reality, but they position him on Sword, and again, he's not in any danger. He stood up waving traffic ashore. And I think many people have this impression that whilst Omaha was this very dangerous beach full of machine gun fire, at Sword, the British just kind of landed and advanced. And that's not the case at all, because Sword was, as I said, mile by mile, as equally well defended as Omaha. And the number of casualties on Sword, again, mile by mile, so on average, per mile was the same on Sword as it was on Omaha, or just ever so slightly less. So it was no less well defended, and it was no less dangerous than Omaha. But because people have seen The Longest Day and they've seen Peter Lawford landing, and it's all very jolly and there's champagne, they have this different impression of what happened at Sword Beach. And in a way, The Longest Day is actually accurate, because when Lord Lovett lands, most of the defences have been neutralised because he's landing 90 minutes after the assault wave. So, yeah, the depiction of Lord Lovett landing is broadly correct, but it's missing out the preceding 90 minutes of what happened.
But it does largely go to plan, at which point does that mean you don't remember it because it's not a cock-up?
Yeah, and I think also there's this thing with Omaha as well, especially since Saving Private Ryan. You know, there was so much loss on Omaha Beach, and there was a great deal of loss. It was a larger beach. But I always feel that now, because that happened, it has to be accounted for. So Omaha has to have been worth it. So Omaha is a beach that's incredibly significant because so many people died. And Sword, that significance is again overlooked because people have this different view of the landing there.
I guess from a memory point of view, you've also got the American cemetery, that massive American cemetery that reinforces it, and the British cemeteries are much more penny packet dotted about.
Much more dispersed, yes. And so you don't have that same emotional sacrifice, I suppose, as you do at Omaha. But that in itself is a little bit misleading as well, because, you know, a lot of the people who are buried at Omaha Cemetery died in 1945 in different parts of France. That just happens to be the principal French cemetery for the Second World War. And so many men who lost their lives are centralised there. They're not all from Normandy, and they're not all from D-Day.
Well, yeah, that's probably a topic unto itself for the legacy of D-Day and how it's remembered. Stephen, thank you for your time. Folks, if you want to read about the landings at Sword Beach, I can highly recommend Stephen's book, Sword Beach, The Untold Story of D-Day's Forgotten Victory. Don't forget, if you have enjoyed this episode of the podcast, you can sign up to be a patron of the show for ad-free listening and extras when I have them. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is all for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tongue, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.